My name's Barbara Goyette. I'm the director here at Hammond-Harwood House. Our story starts in the early 1770s with a fiery patriot named Mathias Hammond. He had a plantation up north of Annapolis in Gambrels, and he had been elected to the state assembly. Of course, Maryland wasn't a state yet, so the colonial assembly, I guess you would call it. And he wanted a townhouse in Annapolis where he could entertain guests and meet his fellow legislators and plan ahead for what was going to be the future of this new world here in America. There was a new architect in town. His name was William Buckland. He had been working across the street at Samuel Chase's house. He'd been hired by the person who owned it at that point, Edward Lloyd, who later became the governor of Maryland. And William Buckland had been working on the interior of that house, but he had gained quite a reputation in Maryland and in Virginia as being kind of the coolest architect around. And Buckland was kind of desperate to show himself in this light of being a foremost figure in Annapolis. Now, Buckland had been born in England, and he had been in the Joiners Guild in London for 7 years. Joiners were like fancy kind of carpenters who carved moldings and fireplace mantels, etc. And when he completed his work there, he really didn't want to face the rest of what it would be like to become, an established worker in England. So he signed an indenture with George Mason. George Mason ended up writing the Bill of Rights a number of years later and lived in Virginia and was building a house which is now called Gunston Hall. Now, when we think about indentures, at least I always used to just think about like housekeepers or yeoman farmers or something like that. But actually there were a lot of indentured artisans who came over from England. They were very well trained in a number of different trades: architecture, joinery, stonemasons, silversmiths. They were very sought out because these talents had not been developed in America quite yet. So Buckland was anxious to start a new life in the new world. He signed this indenture and came over to help George Mason in Virginia with Gunston Hall. He really did a job there. The decorative pieces in Gunston Hall are just incredibly intricate. It's like he thought of every idea that he thought was interesting and put it all on the wall and in the moldings and in the decorative elements. Now, most of the houses at that point that were these, we call them now the great houses, they were big squares. And Buckland really was so ambitious and so anxious to put his mark on his work. He developed a very unusual for the time and place house for Mathias Hammond. So Hammond-Harwood House was started in 1774. Its style is called Anglo-Palladian. That is like houses in England and in Palladian style. Andrea Palladio was a 16th century Venetian architect who wrote a book called The Four Books of Architecture. Buckland had access to that book, and he picked one model in there, the Villa Pisani, which is outside Venice, and he decided to replicate that for the New World. And he adapted the Venetian styles, not only the styles, but the materials for the Maryland colony. So the house is built of brick made here in Maryland. The method of laying the bricks is called Flemish bond, which was very expensive. The house is a 5-part house, so there's a central block portion. There are 2 wings and 2 hyphens connecting the wings to the house. Every feature of a Palladian house is symmetrical and in proportion. And Buckland really carried that out to perfection with Hammond-Harwood house. The rooms themselves have perfect symmetry, just like the outside of the house does. There are even false doors in some of the rooms. So if you have a door on one side leading to a corridor, there's actually a false door on the other side of the room to make it a symmetrical presence. The important thing to realize about William Buckland is that this is the only house that he designed both the exterior and the interior. So he was already well established and well known as a decorator for the interior of houses, but the fact that he did this whole house makes it an incredibly important piece of American architectural history. This house then lent itself to being, of course, beautifully furnished. And luckily, the Hammond-Harwood House Association, who's owned the house since about 1940, was committed to making the house not only a signature piece of architecture, but also a museum of early American decorative art, which would include furniture and also fine art paintings. And the 2 most important names that we have represented at Hammond-Harwood House are John Shaw, who was an Annapolis furniture maker, and Charles Willson Peale, who was an early American artist. John Shaw, the furniture maker, he was born in Scotland and came over when he was about 18 years old and wanted to make a mark for himself. He had been trained and apprenticed himself to some other furniture makers here. And he really had developed this beautiful, beautiful skill. He, of course, used some Chippendale styles, and he also used some Federal styles, but very distinctive and very kind of mid-Atlantic furniture that he made between the years of, say, 1780 and 1825 or 1830. And we have a number of Shaw pieces in the house. We're very proud of them. Some of them are custom pieces. They're quite lovely with a lot of decorative detail, inlays, etc. And then others are quite simple, like a Pembroke table or a card table. But all of them just have beautiful lines. And then I think the second most important part of our collection are the paintings. Charles Willson Peale, he was born on the Eastern Shore. He moved to Annapolis after his father died when he was a child. He apprenticed as a saddle maker, and he said, "Oh, I really, really don't like this very much." And he had visited one of his clients and seen some portraits on the wall, and he said, well, I want to do that. So he started learning how to paint with John Hesselius, who was really the only portrait artist in Annapolis who was working at the time. And then he really showed some promise. So some local gentry kind of chipped in and raised some money and sent him to England for training with Benjamin West. Now, this was a very unusual kind of situation, a kind of patronage situation. And he came back and he was extremely skilled and extremely ambitious. And he ended up painting hundreds of portraits. He had something like 17 children, and many of them became artists. His first batch of children with his first wife, he named after Renaissance artists. So we have Rembrandt and Titian and Rubens, and a second batch he named after scientists. And we have 19 paintings by Peale at Hammond-Harwood House. So we have a really, really wonderful collection. And they're good not only for the artistry involved, but for the stories each portrait tells. These people who lived in and around Annapolis, what was their life like? How did they want to be portrayed? So one pretty cool example of Peale portraits that we have Elizabeth Bordley, who is portrayed as an older woman. She's probably in her 50s. She lived at Bordley House. She was half-sister to James Bordley, who was one of the patrons who sent Peale to England. Next to her, we have another portrait by Sarah Turner, who was her companion for many years, a much younger woman. And you can see that they were painted together. The background is the landscape of the Bordley house, and it continues from her painting into Sarah Turner's painting. So we really do love those two paintings being together, probably for the first time since the 1700s. The family that moved into this house in 1811. It's the first time that a family lived in the house and decorated the house. And the family that moved in were Francis and Richard Loockerman. Francis's father and mother, Judge Jeremiah Chase and his wife Hester Chase, purchased the home for their daughter. So they bought this basically huge house, and that family lived here and their descendants until 1925. So it was a very long period of time that the Loockerman family, which eventually became the Harwood family, lived in the house. So the Loockermans did have 10 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. It must have been an incredibly busy household with Mr. and Mrs. Loockerman, Francis and Richard. And they also had around 5 enslaved women and children who were living up above the kitchen and engaging in cooking, childcare, washing, gardening, chamber pot emptying, silver polishing, all kinds of things that are necessary to run a household. They also served as financial ballast for Richard Loockerman, who often was running into financial difficulties trying to keep this house and all of his children afloat in Maryland's economy. So the oldest of the Loockerman daughters, Hester Ann, when she grew up, she married a gentleman named William Harwood. William Harwood's father was Richard Harwood. Richard Harwood's father was a different Richard Harwood, who was married to one of the daughters of William Buckland. Okay, so that meant that William Harwood came to live in the house that was built by his great-grandfather. And it's true that in Annapolis society, there were a number of families that intermarried through the generations. So this is why Hammond-Harwood House is named Hammond-Harwood House. Hammond for Mathias Hammond, who had the idea to build it, and Harwood for the last family that lived here. What happened was that the last descendant died in 1925. There were no heirs. The house was sold at auction, as were all of the contents. And at that point, there were still a number of beautiful pieces of furniture, paintings, etc. in the house, and those were all sold. The house was bought by St. John's College. At that time, it was a colonial revival spirit in America in the late 1920s. And St. John's decided they wanted to start a museum and start a kind of museum studies program, which would have been the first in America. Well, as soon as they got that underway, the Depression happened and they had to sell the house. The house was vacant for a couple of years, but then it was bought by a group of women in Baltimore, the Federated Garden Clubs of Maryland, and they declared themselves the Hammond-Harwood House Association. They took the auction list and they bought back many of the items that had been sold at the 1925 auction, including in the dining room table, the chairs, the sideboard, which is a John Straw piece, a number of the Peale paintings. So in Hammond-Harwood House, about 30% of the collection belonged to the family that lived here or is definitely related to people who knew the family. And it gives the house a real sense of authenticity. So at this point, Hammond-Harwood House is both a historic site, a house museum, and a fine arts museum. And we are open to the public from April to December every year, every day except for Tuesdays. This year we have a very special exhibition of works by women early American painters, which is an unusual situation. Mostly it was men who were making their mark in the art world, but we have 22 paintings by women from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s. Most of them are members of the Peale family. As we talked about before, Peale liked to educate his children and his grandchildren into painting. So that's a special exhibit. And then we'll have another special exhibit beginning in August of Annapolis silver. There were 13 silversmiths who were active in Annapolis in the colonial period. And we'll be bringing their works to showcase. Hammond-Harwood House has a number of special tours and programs that are run throughout the season. Everything from special tours that talk about Jane Austen and the connection between Jane Austen's world and the world of Hammond-Harwood House. We have African American history tours. We have tours focusing on furniture, on paintings. We have poetry workshops. We have watercolor workshops, all kinds of interesting programs. And we really hope people will come visit Hammond-Harwood House, learn our history, and appreciate the heritage that exists here in Annapolis.